The crystalline halls of Velorax Prime had witnessed the rise and fall of empires that spanned entire galaxies. Yet never before had they echoed with such open mockery as they did on this particular cycle. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the central podium, a small figure surrounded by beings that defied human imagination. And she kept her spine straight, even as the laughter washed over her like waves crashing against ancient stone. The council chamber stretched in all directions, a massive sphere of living crystal that pulsed with soft light. And within this sphere floated the representatives of 47 spacefaring civilizations that had mastered the secrets of the universe long before humanity had learned to make fire. The Kathrani delegate dominated the eastern quadrant, a massive insectoid creature standing nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous armor gleaming like polished obsidian under the chamber's ambient glow. And when he laughed, his mandibles clicked together in a sound that resembled bones breaking. "You cannot be serious," the Kathrani said through the universal translator, his compound eyes reflecting Elena's image 1,000 times over. "These creatures wish to join our council when they have barely learned to crawl beyond their own star system." The Vellani representative, a being of pure coherent light that shifted through colors no human eye could properly perceive, pulsed in what Elena had learned to recognize as agreement. "Our records indicate that humans have been traveling between stars for merely 2 centuries, the Vellani said, its voice like wind chimes in a storm. "The youngest among our current members achieved interstellar travel over 40,000 of their years ago." Elena opened her mouth to respond, but the Synthesis Collective cut her off, their shared consciousness speaking through a dozen different biological forms scattered throughout the chamber. Furthermore, the collective intoned in perfect unison, "Humans possess no natural advantages that would benefit our alliance, for they have no telepathic abilities to share information instantly across distances, no redundant organ systems to survive catastrophic damage, no natural armor or weapons, and no innate resistance to the radiation that permeates space travel." The laughter grew louder, and Elena noticed that even the more reserved species had begun to show signs of amusement at her presence. The Morvathi delegate, a silicon-based life form that resembled a flowing sculpture of living gemstone, rumbled with what might have been chuckling. "Their homeworld is a middling rock orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an unfashionable arm of an average galaxy," the Morvathi observed. "They have no ancient lineage, no great accomplishments to speak of, and their own history is filled with evidence that they cannot even maintain peace among themselves." Elena felt the weight of their dismissal pressing down upon her. But she had faced worse odds before, and she had been chosen for this mission precisely because she did not break under pressure. "Distinguished members of the council," she began, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Earth and her colonies formally petitioned for associate membership in recognition of our expanding presence in this sector and our desire for peaceful cooperation with all spacefaring peoples." The Kathrani delegate made a sound at the translator, rendered as something between a scoff and a snarl. "Associate membership requires a species to demonstrate either significant technological contribution or strategic value," he said, rising to his full height so that his shadow fell across Elena like a death sentence. "Your species offers neither, for your technology is derivative of salvaged alien artifacts, and your military capacity is laughable by any meaningful standard." He gestured with one of his forearms toward the data crystals Elena had presented. "My people have never lost a war in 8,000 years of recorded conflict," the Kathrani continued with obvious pride. "We have conquered species that were ancient when your ancestors were still swimming in primordial oceans. So tell me, little human, what could your kind possibly offer that would make us consider you as equals?" The chamber erupted in another wave of mocking sounds, And Elena stood silent as the delegates dismissed her petition with casual cruelty. The vote came swiftly, as she had expected it would, and it was unanimous in its rejection. "The petition is tabled indefinitely," the council speaker announced. A massive creature of unknown origin, whose body seemed to exist partially in dimensions that hurt Elena's eyes to observe. "The human delegation may submit again, when they have achieved something worthy of our consideration." Elena gathered her documents with careful dignity, refusing to let them see how their words had cut her. And she was preparing to leave when a new presence approached her. The librarian of the archives moved slowly, as befitted a being of such tremendous age, and its body was a shifting mass of organic matter that seemed to flow rather than walk, with countless eyes opening and closing across its surface like stars being born and dying in an accelerating universe. "Ambassador Vasquez," the librarian said, its voice ancient and patient like mountains eroding into sand. "I am the keeper of all knowledge that this council has accumulated across the eons, and I find myself curious about your species." Elena paused, uncertain of this creature's intentions. "I would like to request access to your historical records," the librarian continued, "specifically your military archives. For I have found that one can learn much about a species by studying how they wage war." Elena considered the request for a moment, then shrugged with a casualness that surprised even herself. "I see no reason to refuse," she said, transmitting the access codes to the librarian's personal data systems. "Our history is not a secret, and perhaps you will find something there that will help you understand us better." The librarian accepted the codes and began to withdraw. But Elena noticed something strange in the way its many eyes focused on her. "Tell me, Ambassador," the librarian said, pausing at the edge of the chamber, "in your species' history, what is the longest conflict you have recorded?" Elena thought for a moment before answering. "That would depend on how you define a single conflict," she said. "But some of our wars lasted for decades, and one religious conflict continued in various forms for several centuries." The librarian was silent for a long moment, and Elena could have sworn she saw something like surprise ripple across its ancient form. "Centuries," it repeated, the words seeming to hang in the air between them. "Your species fought a single war for centuries," Elena nodded. Unsure why this seemed significant, the librarian departed without another word, leaving Elena alone in the great chamber where the echoes of alien laughter still seemed to linger in the crystal walls. She did not know it then, but she had just set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of galactic civilization. The council had laughed at humanity today, but they would not be laughing for much longer. The archives of Velorax Prime existed in a space between spaces, a dimension carved out of reality itself to house the accumulated knowledge of countless civilizations across millions of years. And within this impossible library, the librarian began to read. The Ulithane had served as keepers of knowledge since before most current council species had achieved sentience, and their unique relationship with time allowed them to process information in ways that other beings could not comprehend. Experiencing centuries of data in what seemed like moments, the librarian had expected to find the usual patterns in humanity's war records. For all species followed predictable paths when it came to conflict, with wars fought over resources and territory and ideology until eventually the species either destroyed itself or matured beyond such primitive behavior. What the librarian found instead was something that had no parallel in all the archives. The first record seemed ordinary enough, showing conflicts between small groups using primitive weapons. But as the librarian moved forward through human history, something deeply unsettling began to emerge. The scale was wrong. A war that humans called World War II had killed 70 million of their kind. a number so large that the librarian had to pause and verify the data multiple times. For surely this must be an error in translation, but it was not an error. 70 million dead. And the species had not only survived, but emerged stronger than before. The librarian dove deeper into the records and found horror after horror that defied everything the archives had documented about moral species. At a place called Stalingrad, humans had fought for control of a single city for months, enduring temperatures that would have killed most carbon-based life forms, suffering casualties in the hundreds of thousands. And yet neither side had surrendered or retreated. The librarian found records of human soldiers continuing to fight with wounds that would have triggered automatic shutdown in any sensible nervous system, of warriors crawling across frozen ground with limbs destroyed by explosives, dragging themselves toward the enemy with nothing but determination keeping them alive. At a place called Verdun, two human factions had thrown themselves at each other for nearly a year, losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers over a few kilometers of destroyed landscape. And when it was over, neither side had gained any meaningful advantage. Yet neither had considered stopping. The librarian's many forms shuddered across multiple dimensions as the true nature of humanity began to reveal itself. These were not the records of a young and foolish species that had not yet learned the cost of war. These were the records of a species that knew exactly what war cost and chose to pay that price again and again and again. The psychological profiles were perhaps the most disturbing element of all. Every other species in the Council's records showed predictable responses to combat stress, with fear increasing as danger increased, with the will to fight decreasing as casualties mounted, with eventual surrender or retreat when the situation became hopeless. Humans showed the opposite pattern when cornered, when outnumbered, when facing certain death. Human combat effectiveness did not decrease, but increased, as if some ancient part of their brain recognized that survival required becoming more dangerous rather than less. The librarian found records of a battle called Thermopylae, where a small force of humans had chosen to die, fighting against overwhelming odds rather than retreat. Not because they did not understand they would die, but precisely because they did understand. They had made death their weapon. The records showed humans developing explosive devices capable of splitting atoms themselves, creating weapons that could turn entire cities into ash in an instant. And the librarian expected to see these weapons used once and then abandoned in horror. Instead, the humans had built thousands more. They had pointed these world-ending weapons at each other across their small planet and lived under the threat of total extinction for decades, treating this situation not as madness, but as a reasonable approach to maintaining peace. The librarian processed data for what would have been days in normal time, and with each passing moment, the picture grew more terrifying. Humans did not simply fight when threatened. Humans did not simply survive when attacked. Humans persisted in ways that violated every known principle of biological self-preservation. They built hospitals on battlefields to repair their wounded so they could send them back to fight again. They created entire industries dedicated to producing weapons of war with an efficiency that suggested this was their natural state. They wrote songs about their wars and taught their children to honor those who had died in combat, ensuring that each new generation would carry the same willingness to sacrifice. The librarian found records of human civilians enduring sustained bombardment of their cities for months and years, of populations being starved and frozen and burned, and instead of surrendering, these civilians had emerged from their shelters to rebuild what had been destroyed and continue resisting. There was a word that kept appearing in the human records, a concept that the translators struggled to render properly, and that word was spite. humans would continue fighting not because they believed they could win, but simply to ensure their enemies would suffer for their victory. The librarian had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across the long march of time, had seen species that could reshape reality with their thoughts and beings that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But never had the librarian encountered anything like humanity. These creatures were not primitive. They were simply different in ways that made them potentially the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever produced. Librarian closed the archives and initiated a protocol that had not been used in 4,000 years, sending a pulse across the quantum networks that connected Council space. The message was simple but urgent: threat reassessment required. All Council members were to convene immediately at Velorax Prime to receive information critical to the survival of galactic civilization. The Kathrani delegate responded first, his irritation clear even across the vast distances of space. "This had better be important," his message read. "We have more pressing matters than discussing the failed petition of those hairless primates." The librarian did not respond directly. Instead, the librarian began preparing the war logs for presentation, selecting the records that would most efficiently convey the true nature of humanity to beings who had never encountered anything like them. The Council had laughed at humans. They had dismissed them as primitive and weak and irrelevant. They had not understood what they were truly looking at, but they would understand soon enough. The librarian had served this council for eons beyond counting, had guided them through crises that threatened to tear apart the fabric of spacetime itself. And never before had the librarian felt anything like the cold dread that now filled its ancient form. The humans were coming, and if the council did not act wisely, they would learn firsthand why humanity had survived every horror their universe had thrown at them. They would learn what it meant to fight a species that did not know how to stop. The council chamber was filled with the sounds of irritation as the delegates assembled for the emergency session, their various forms of displeasure ranging from the Kathrani's aggressive mandible clicking to the Villani's sharp pulses of discordant light. "This is most irregular," the council speaker announced, its voice resonating across dimensions that most beings could not perceive. "The librarian has invoked the protocol of urgent revelation, which has not been used since the void incursion 4,000 years past." The Kathrani delegate rose to his full height, his compound eyes reflecting the assembled delegates in fractal patterns. "I demand to know why we have been summoned," he said, his translator rendering his tone as somewhere between anger and contempt. "My fleet is engaged in patrol operations along the border territories, and I do not have time for games." The librarian emerged from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, its ancient form flowing like water made solid, and every eye in the room turned to watch its approach. "You have time for this," the librarian said simply. "You must make time for this. For what I have discovered in the human war logs changes everything we thought we knew about the species that petitioned this council." The Marvathi delegate rumbled with barely contained impatience. "The humans are primitives," the crystalline being said. "What could possibly be in their records that would warrant interrupting the business of this council?" The librarian did not answer with words. Instead, the ancient being activated the chamber's shared consciousness network, a technology that allowed all delegates to experience information directly rather than simply receiving it through their senses. "I will show you," the librarian said. "I will show you what humans truly are." The first image that flooded the consciousness of every delegate was a city called Stalingrad, and they experienced it not as distant history, but as raw data pouring directly into their minds. They felt the cold first, a temperature so extreme that it would have killed most of the species present within hours. and they understood that humans had fought in this cold for months without adequate protection. They experienced the casualty figures not as numbers, but as individual deaths. Each one a sentient being torn apart by weapons or frozen in the snow, or starved until their bodies simply stopped functioning. The Gaithrani delegate made a sound that his translator could not properly render. Something between shock and denial. "This cannot be accurate," he said, his voice losing its earlier contempt. "Your data must be corrupted. For no species would continue fighting under such conditions." The librarian shifted the shared experience to Verdun, and the delegates watched as two human factions threw themselves at each other across a landscape that had been transformed into something resembling a vision of ultimate destruction. Artillery fire fell like rain made of death, and humans charged into it anyway. Soldiers died by the thousands, and more humans arrived to take their places. The battle lasted for 300 days. And when it finally ended, the front lines had barely moved at all. Yet neither side had considered surrender. The Villani representative flickered through colors that indicated deep distress. Why did they not simply retreat? The light being asked. Our calculations indicate that both sides could have preserved their forces by withdrawing. So why did they choose to continue losing so many of their kind? The librarian showed them the psychological profiles, the data that explained how human minds responded to combat stress. They could not retreat, the librarian said. Not because retreat was impossible, but because their psychology would not allow it. For humans possess a quality that we have not encountered in any other species. The shared consciousness shifted to a place called Thermopylae, and the delegates watched a small group of human warriors prepare to face an army that outnumbered them by hundreds to one. These humans knew they were going to die. They had sent their allies away and remained behind specifically to die fighting. The delegates experienced the battle through the available records, watching humans fall one by one until none remained. And they felt something they had never felt when studying the history of any other species: fear. The Kathrani delegate broke the connection, his massive form trembling in ways that his species normally only displayed before death. "Enough," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "We have seen enough." "You have not seen enough," the librarian replied, and there was something almost like pity in its ancient voice. "You have not yet understood what these creatures represent." The shared consciousness activated again, and this time the delegates saw something that made the previous horrors seem almost reasonable by comparison. They saw the atomic bombs falling on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They experienced the data of what nuclear weapons did to living beings, the heat that vaporized bodies in an instant, the radiation that poisoned survivors for years afterward, the destruction of entire cities in single moments. And then they saw what humans did next. Instead of abandoning these weapons in horror at what they had created, humans built thousands more. The Synthesis Collective spoke for the first time, their shared voice trembling across their many forms. They developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, the collective said. And then they built enough of those weapons to destroy their world many times over, which is not the behavior of a rational species. The librarian showed them the concept of mutually assured destruction, the strategy by which humans had prevented nuclear war by ensuring that any attack would result in the complete extinction of both sides. They used the threat of their own extinction as a tool for maintaining peace, the librarian explained. They lived for decades under conditions that should have driven any species to madness, with death hanging over them at every moment. And they simply continued with their lives. The chamber was silent now, the earlier mockery forgotten entirely. The librarian showed them one final set of records, footage of human soldiers sustaining what any other species would consider extinction-level casualties and continuing To advance, the Kathrani consider a 3% casualty rate. Grounds for withdrawal, the librarian said, focusing its attention on the insectoid delegate. These humans sustained 80% casualties and did not stop fighting. And the survivors did not retreat, but pushed forward into the very guns that had killed their companions. The Kathrani delegate lowered himself slowly to his resting position, a gesture his species made only when confronted with something they could not overcome through strength. "What are they?" he asked, and for the first time since anyone could remember, his voice held something that sounded like respect. The librarian let the silence stretch for a long moment before answering. "They are persistence hunters," the ancient being said. Their ancestors survived on their homeworld by chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. And they have carried this trait into everything they do, including war, for they do not need to be stronger than their enemies, or faster, or more numerous, because they simply need to refuse to stop. The council chamber remained silent as the delegates processed what they had witnessed. Their earlier dismissal of humanity transformed into something far more complicated. The librarian had shown them the truth, and the truth was terrifying. The silence that filled the council chamber was unlike any that had come before, for this was not the comfortable silence of beings waiting their turn to speak, but the heavy silence of minds struggling to accept what they had witnessed. A younger delegate from the Synthesis Collective finally broke the stillness, their merged consciousness speaking through a form that appeared almost fragile compared to the ancient power surrounding it. "I do not understand," the young delegate said. "How have humans not destroyed themselves entirely? For the records show that they came close to extinction multiple times. Yet they somehow survived each crisis and continued expanding." The librarian moved to the center of the chamber, its ancient form casting shadows that seemed to shift through time itself. "That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what I have discovered," the librarian said. "Humans have developed methods for channeling their destructive nature rather than being consumed by it." The shared consciousness activated once more. But this time, the images were different. The delegates saw humans after their great wars, not celebrating victory, but building institutions designed to prevent future conflicts. They saw the creation of international organizations, treaties, and agreements that bound former enemies together in webs of mutual obligation. They saw something called the Marshall Plan, where victorious humans had helped rebuild the civilizations they had just finished destroying, turning conquered enemies into loyal allies within a single generation. "They do not simply win wars," the librarian explained. "They win the peace that follows, for they understand that true victory means transforming enemies into friends, rather than simply killing them." The Villani representative pulsed with colors that indicated confusion, but the records you showed us displayed such terrible violence. The light being said, "How can the same species be capable of both the destruction we witnessed and the cooperation you now describe?" The librarian made a gesture that roughly translated as acknowledgement. "That is precisely what makes them so dangerous," the ancient being said. "Humans are not simply violent, for pure violence would have destroyed them long ago. Instead, they are adaptive in ways we have not seen before." The librarian showed them records of human scientists working to cure diseases, of engineers building systems to provide clean water to populations that had none, of artists creating works of beauty that moved their viewers to tears. The same determination that drives them in war drives them in peace. The librarian continued. The same refusal to surrender that kept them fighting at Stalingrad keeps them working in laboratories until they conquer illnesses that killed millions. The Kathrani delegate spoke, his voice still carrying the weight of what he had witnessed earlier. "You speak as though they cannot be stopped," he said. "But surely their lack of natural weapons and armor makes them vulnerable. For my soldiers could kill dozens of humans each before falling." The librarian turned its many eyes toward the Kathrani. Your soldiers could indeed kill many humans. The ancient being agreed. And then more humans would come. And your soldiers would kill them as well. And more would still come. Until eventually your soldiers grew tired or ran out of ammunition. And then the humans would still be coming. The librarian projected a new set of data into the shared consciousness. I have calculated their expansion rate based on historical patterns. The librarian said, humans have been spacefaring for 2 centuries. And in that time they have established colonies on 17 worlds, with populations growing at rates that exceed most species in the Council. The numbers hung in the air. Undeniable and terrifying, based on current trajectories, the librarian continued. Humans will achieve military parity with the Kathrani hegemony within 3 generations, and within 5 generations. They will likely surpass every individual species currently represented in this council. The Kathrani delegate rose abruptly, his mandibles clicking with something that sounded like protest. That is impossible, he said. My people have been building our military capacity for 8,000 years. So these creatures cannot possibly match us in mere generations. The librarian showed him the data behind the calculations, human population, growth rates that seemed almost biological in their exponential. Nature human industrial capacity that doubled and redoubled with each passing decade, human scientific advancement that accelerated rather than slowing as they encountered new challenges. They do not need to match your current capacity, the librarian said. They simply need to continue growing at their current rate while your growth remains stable. For time favors the species that does not slow down. The Morvathi delegate spoke, its crystalline voice carrying notes of what might have been fear. What about their weaknesses? The silicon-based being asked. Surely their biology limits them, for they require specific atmospheric conditions and temperature ranges to survive. The librarian responded by showing records of humans surviving in environments that should have killed them. Humans living at the bottom of their oceans in pressurized habitats, humans working in the vacuum of space protected only by thin suits of fabric and metal, humans enduring the radiation of their stars' flares and continuing their work regardless. They do not wait for evolution to adapt them to new environments, the librarian explained. They build tools and technologies that allow them to survive anywhere. And they do this with a speed that suggests they consider hostile environments not as barriers, but as challenges to be overcome. The council speaker shifted in ways that suggested deep discomfort. You paint a picture of a species that cannot be contained, the speaker said. But surely there must be limits to what they can achieve. The librarian was silent for a long moment. I have searched the archives for any species that shares humanity's characteristics, the ancient being finally said. And I have found nothing comparable. For every other species in our records either destroyed itself through internal conflict, was conquered by more powerful neighbors, or evolved beyond violence as they matured. The librarian's form seemed to dim slightly, as if the weight of its own words was affecting even its ancient essence. Humans have done none of these things, the librarian continued. They have not destroyed themselves despite having the means to do so many times over. They have not been conquered despite facing threats that would have ended most species. And they show no signs of evolving beyond violence despite achieving technological sophistication. The chamber absorbed this information in heavy silence. They are something new, the librarian concluded. Something that our models cannot predict and our experience cannot explain. And they are growing stronger with every passing year. The synthesis collective spoke, their shared voice carrying overtones of what might have been acceptance. Then the question before this council is not whether to admit humans, the collective said. The question is what we should do with the knowledge that they are coming regardless of our decision. The librarian made a gesture of agreement. You begin to understand, the ancient being said. The humans did not come to this council seeking permission to exist. For they exist already, and will continue to exist whether we acknowledge them or not. The delegates looked at one another, their earlier mockery now seeming like the foolishness of children who had laughed at an approaching storm. They came to give us a choice, the librarian said. And that choice is simple. The ancient being paused, ensuring that every delegate was focused on its words. We can be their allies, the librarian said. Or we can learn what it means to stand against a species that does not know how to surrender. The debate raged through the night cycle and into the morning, voices rising and falling like waves against the crystalline walls of the council chamber. And for the first time in living memory, the delegates were truly afraid. Preemptive action is our only logical choice, the Synthesis Collective argued. Their merged consciousness projecting scenarios of human expansion across holographic displays. We strike now while they are weak, before they can grow strong enough to threaten us. The Morvathi delegate rumbled agreement, its crystalline form vibrating with barely contained aggression. Our combined fleets could reach their core worlds within weeks, the silicon-based being said. We have the firepower to reduce their colonies to ash before they even understand what is happening. But the Kathrani delegate, the very same who had laughed loudest at humanity just days before, rose to oppose this plan. And his intervention shocked the chamber into silence. You have not been listening, the Kathrani said, his compound eyes scanning the assembly with something approaching contempt. You have witnessed what these creatures are capable of. Yet you still believe you can simply crush them. He activated his own display, showing projections that made several delegates recoil. My species has studied predators across 1,000 worlds, the Kathrani continued. We understand hunting and being hunted better than any species represented here. And I tell you now that attacking humans would be the greatest mistake this council has ever made. The Villani representative flickered with skepticism. Surely their military capacity cannot match ours. The light being said, your own assessment rated them as primitive. The Kathrani made a clicking sound that his translator rendered as bitter laughter. I rated their current capacity as primitive, he said. Their potential is something else entirely. For the librarian showed us what happens when humans perceive an existential threat. He displayed records of human weapons development during their major conflicts, showing how their industrial output increased exponentially when they believed their survival was at stake in their Second Great War. Humans increased weapons production by over 300% in just 4 years, the Kathrani said. They converted civilian factories to military production overnight, and their entire population mobilized for conflict. His mandibles clicked with emphasis. If we attack them, we do not destroy the threat, he said. We unify them against us. And we give them exactly the kind of enemy they are best equipped to fight. The Synthesis Collective processed this information. Their many forms exchanging data at speeds that would have overwhelmed most organic minds. Then containment. The collective proposed. We establish quarantine zones around human space, prevent their expansion, and wait for them to destroy themselves as the statistics suggest they should. The librarian spoke from the edge of the chamber. The statistics also suggested they would never achieve spaceflight, the ancient being said. They have already begun establishing colonies beyond the zones you could reasonably patrol, and their history demonstrates a marked tendency to reject boundaries. The Morvathi delegate made a sound of frustration. Then what do you propose? The crystalline being demanded. Should we simply do nothing while they grow strong enough to threaten everything we have built? The council speaker raised its form, commanding attention through presence alone. A new motion has been proposed, the speaker announced, and this council must consider it carefully. The delegates fell silent. Waiting, the motion is for full membership, the speaker said. with all rights and responsibilities that such status entails. Effective immediately, chaos erupted in the chamber, with voices overlapping in dozens of languages as delegates expressed their disbelief. Full membership has not been granted to a new species in over 12,000 years. The Villani representative protested. The requirements are meant to ensure that only truly advanced civilizations join our ranks. The Kathrani delegate responded before anyone else could speak. And what exactly are those requirements? He asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Technological sophistication sufficient to contribute to our shared knowledge base. Strategic value sufficient to strengthen our alliance. And demonstrated capacity for cooperation with other species. He gestured toward the data displays still showing human history. Humans have reverse engineered and improved upon every piece of alien technology they have encountered, he said. Their strategic value should be obvious to anyone who watched the librarian's presentation. And their capacity for cooperation is demonstrated by the fact that their species even exists. For creatures who could not cooperate would have destroyed themselves long ago. The chamber quieted as delegates considered his words. But beyond all of this, the Kathrani continued, his voice taking on a weight that made even the most ancient delegates pay attention. There is a simpler truth that we must acknowledge. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes and sensors of every representative present. The humans are not asking our permission, he said. They are informing us of their arrival, and the only choice we have is whether we greet them as friends or face them as enemies. The vote was called, and one by one, the delegates registered their decisions. The Synthesis Collective voted yes, their logic processing ultimately concluding that alliance was more survivable than conflict. The Marvathi voted yes after long hesitation, their silicon consciousness running simulations that all ended the same way. The Villani voted yes, their light forms pulsing with something that might have been respect. And the Kathrani, the great warriors who had never lost a war in 8,000 years, voted yes with something that sounded almost like eagerness when the final count was announced. It was unanimous. A message was sent to Ambassador Elena Vasquez, requesting her immediate presence in the council chamber. She arrived alone, still wearing the same formal attire from her dismissed petition, her face carefully neutral as she entered the massive space where she had been laughed at just days before. But the chamber was different now. Every delegate was standing. A gesture of acknowledgement that the librarian had explained was reserved only for the recognition of equals. The council speaker addressed her directly, Ambassador Vasquez. The speaker said, its voice resonating across dimensions, "This council has reviewed the war logs of your species, and we have reached a decision regarding your petition for membership." Alina stood straight. "Waiting full membership is granted," the speaker continued, "effective immediately, with all rights and responsibilities that such status entails." The Kathrani delegate approached her, his massive form moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and he stopped just before her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to meet his compound eyes. "We have reviewed your war logs," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the translator. "We would prefer you as allies," Elena smiled, and several delegates noted how the expression caused her lips to part, revealing the teeth that her species had, evolved as omnivorous predators on a hostile world. "We accept," she said simply. The Kathrani extended one of his forearms in a gesture his species reserved for those they considered worthy opponents. "Your species is strange," he said. "You are soft and fragile and short-lived. Yet you have somehow convinced this council that you are worth fearing." Elena took his arm in the traditional grip, her small hand nearly lost against his massive limb. "We prefer to say we are worth respecting," she replied. The Kathrani made a sound that his translator could not render. But Elena somehow understood it was laughter of a different kind than what she had heard before. "Come," he said, "there is much to discuss. And your species has already wasted 2 centuries getting here." As Ambassador Vasquez walked alongside the Kathrani delegate, surrounded by beings that had considered her species nothing but a joke mere days ago, she allowed herself to feel something like satisfaction. The council had laughed at humanity. They had dismissed her people as primitives unworthy of consideration, that they had made the mistake of asking to see the war logs, and now they understood what humans had always known, that the universe was vast and dangerous and indifferent to suffering, and that humanity had survived it all anyway. They would survive this too. They would survive everything, because that was what humans did. The end.